Welcome to the Tanz im August podcast. This podcast series is part of the Tanz im August Festival, presented by HAU Hebbel am Ufer. This year it takes place from 13th to 30th of August in Berlin. Several artists from this year's program have been invited to join a conversation series. In each episode, they share insights into their lives and creative work. The artists talk about their past and current projects and offering in-depth perspectives on the works they are presenting at Tanz im August. In this episode, Ricardo Carmona, artistic director of the festival, talks with Neve Harrington. She will present her work Screensaver Series, Sleeper Softwares, on 27th, 28th and 29th of August at St. Elisabeth-Kirche.
Hello, Neve. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining the podcast. I would like to ask you first to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, my name's Neve Harrington. I'm an artist based in London, in the UK. I'm working with lots of different materials, mostly known for working in dance.
Your work moves between different materials and genders. So you do choreography, you also practice a lot of writing and installations. And how do you decide how the shape of the project will be? Do you start with an idea or the form emerges from the process?
It's such a good question. I guess it's been a while since I started a new project. So when I was thinking about this question, I was realizing that it's quite hard to give an answer in 2025. So I was kind of like thinking back to like how things began, because my processes tend to take me quite a long time. So therefore they gather lots of different kind of learning and experience along the way. But I think your question, in a way, it's about form, right? Form and materials. Yeah. I think something that's quite important to me is that the works don't start like a priori as dance, even though they tend to end up in dance or be understood as dance and dancing. I don't kind of feel that like art form boundary at the beginning. I tend to think of all of my works as being kind of visual cultures, which involve, for me, inevitably like movement and choreography, but also the design, like how I imagine. So I draw a lot as part of my process. So I often are kind of drawing maps or sketches or plans for how the work might meet an audience. And therefore, like the conventions that I'm going to work in are also maybe as important, sometimes more important even than the idea. So, for example, a work that I've been touring the last few years is called Satellizer, a Dance for the Gallery. And that work really came out of a set of questions that I was building as I was working as a performer, mostly in durational work in a gallery context, for example. Yeah, I don't know if that's not a great answer to your question.
No, it is. Yeah. I mean, I think it gives us an insight of how the process of the creation also informs the shape of the final result. Yeah. So the work that we're going to present in Berlin in August is part of a series. And it has this very interesting subtitle of the screensavers. What drew your attention to screensavers, and how do you thought about like this is a good material to make a work or even a series, because it's by now it's a series?
So I think of, and I think you're going to ask me some questions around time and how I build these works and language and all of those things. That sort of all comes together. But you're right. So the work is called Screensaver Series, and it has been presented a few times now. And I always think of the different iterations as like sisters or siblings of each other. So to an audience, they should have all of the same ingredients, but inevitably they're a little bit different. And I'll say more about that maybe later. But yeah, I got really interested in screensavers in maybe like 2014, 15. I was thinking, as well, a lot of my works do, about time and different kind of relationships to time. And I was noticing myself saying, I don't know, a lot. And I kept like coming back to the screen of I don't know by saying that it's it's not true that I don't know. I'm sort of buying myself time for maybe a time when I do know something. And I think we do this a lot, this kind of like placeholder of, in this case, this phrase, I don't know. And I was thinking a lot about kind of like keeping pace with the speed of things that are being asked. Sometimes when we're talking, we're addressed by a conversation and we don't always have an answer right there and then. And around that time, I was also thinking quite a lot about, in relation to this gallery work that I mentioned, about labour and work and kind of the work of producing meaning. And I had a set of questions for myself as a younger maker, which were, well, considering I've mostly not made things for theatre spaces, mostly I've been really interested in situations where people can come and go and spend different amounts of time, and how their own movement, their own different perspectives are in an active dialogue with the work, which, side note, I think is always the case. I had this question, what would it be if I was ever to receive a commission or an opportunity to make a work for the theatre? How would I bring together those conventions of kind of a slightly more, let's just say temporarily, traditional spectatorship, of sort of mostly being together in time, facing forward, the thing happens, it unfolds in front of you, you had to know about it beforehand, you had to get your ticket, you had to get organised to be there, all those things. And it just brought to me, how the screensaver pops up on the computer when we're not at work. It's like his commentary, and like it's like a beautiful reward for like not doing your work. At least that's how I was seeing it. I just got like really interested in screensavers, like on my own computer screen, and like playing around with what was possible. And then I was like learning a bit more about them. So I was like, I feel like this is connected to this question of I don't know, or this holding off of a thing, as if like the work I'm supposed to be doing is behind the screensaver, but maybe the screensaver is also the work. And then I looked at the history of screensavers and what their function was, which was chemical, to prevent burn-in on the screen. That was an original function. So screens had to always be moving, otherwise there'd be like a kind of a chemical burn-in. And some of us who are a little bit, let's say, people maybe who were born before the mid-80s, possibly, might remember seeing computers actually that have parts of images or text burnt into the screen because the screens had stopped moving. So there was a real reason to keep moving happening. And I thought that was like interesting in how we might think about paying attention, about processing, about what happens when we kind of get stuck and we can't move our thoughts. And so I kind of used that analogy to think about, well, I think at that time, the only work I could imagine making for a theatre was some kind of screensaver for a theatre space. So obviously there's more to say about it, but yeah, that's kind of how it began.
So you also mentioned the word attention a couple of times since we are talking, and you also talk about the series as a soft choreography of attention. So can you expand on this and how attention is part of the series, both for your creation and also for the viewers?
I guess something that a perspective that I think I'm always bringing to the things I make, as I've now gone on to make more work, is understanding that whatever it is that any of us are paying attention to, we're not at the same time paying attention to everything. And also that combined, we can't pay attention to everything. And so kind of parts of attention or partiality is kind of interesting. And I think that can mean both that different materials in the same work or the same environment might be doing different things, almost like a musical score. Different, maybe musical instruments have a different line or part of that. I think what's happening in the space, what's happening maybe with costuming or who the people are who are doing the work, all of those things are bringing something that might agree with or disagree with another part of the work. And then I also mean multi-partiality in the sense, because I previously told you a little bit about how I started making, mostly for environments where people are moving around. I became more and more interested in different perspectives and how in a physical space we can literally understand that if I stand here, then I can see and experience something slightly differently to you. And I was interested in, well, what if I could both bring together and also take apart those different perspectives at the same time? So to make that maybe a bit more understandable, the screensaver is in one plane, in kind of like the flat plane in front of you. So I'm moving my hand up and down, like as if I was looking at a screen. We're creating this kind of morphing, moving image, which is a little bit like the screensavers you see that pop up on your computer. But if you see us from the side, then you've immediately got a completely different perspective of the same thing, which is more like the architecture of that activity. So all the things that we do as dancers to make that image possible, which is often obscured by staying with the other flat image, which for me is just bringing attention to, at times, the thing that we maybe want to be seen, perhaps in this slightly more traditional convention of performance making, so the thing that we want to see on the stage, but then also the labour that goes into that thing being possible, and how I think in the Screensaver we really accept as a kind of humility project that sometimes there are also like these glitches or things that like missed connections, and that's also part of the set of relationships. And so by giving the audience, in the case of the Screensaver, the opportunity to see us from both the front and the side, and it's all part of the same work, it's playing with something that I think we're busy with in dancing in general, which is sometimes how to disguise or how we highlight or emphasize certain qualities being seen whilst minimizing or concealing. Not hiding exactly, but we're playing with attention always actually in dance. So again, it's some kind of answer to your question. I don't know if it's the most clear answer, because yours was about attention.
Yeah, but also, I mean, you did speak about how you also direct attention in different perspectives, and I think this also relates to the work that you've been doing in the last years that don't necessarily all go to, let's say, conventional black box frontal situation. And this will be also the case of this work that we're going to show here during the festival, that people can move around, that they are positioned around the performers in an open space. And this also allows different attentions and also this different perspectives on this. And actually, I'm curious also to talk a bit more about this approach that you have, because as we spoke before, you do also installations in galleries and also other forms of art. Do you feel a bit constrained by the, let's say, traditional theater apparatus, or it's something that evolves organically? So my question is that, are you consciously avoiding the frontal theater space, or it's something that comes natural because of the processes?
I think at this point it's probably a little bit of both. I think the questions that I had as a younger maker didn't feel necessarily compatible with the conventions of the more traditional like proscenium art theatre spaces. But also my questions as a maker actually didn't really take me there. So sort of in my earlier journey, it was through studying dance, but also studying psychology at university, and also then going to a visual arts school and studying book arts. So I'm happy to be working inside and with dance and dancing and choreography, but I also acknowledge that there's aspects of what it is that I want to make as an artist which are also pulling from, I guess, other ways of making and knowing, other inquiries. At this point also, I mean, once we start going down a track as well, like I've built an understanding of how to work in some particular environments, and those have then sort of reinforced my inquiries and my interests. So it would be curious to try to make work for this other kind of convention. But my most recent project, Sometimes, which went to those spaces like Sadler's Wells, Lillian Baylis, I still had the audience in the round. So, and that was to accommodate the kind of space that I wanted to build. So I was both working with, but also pushing against that convention. So I think I'm curious to see what I would do with an invitation to make for that space.
You've spoken publicly about being neurodivergent. So in what way that shaped your approach to creating work and also to sensing and making the projects?
I think it's inseparable in a way. It's like, how do those structures that we don't know about, we can kind of seek diagnostic processes which can again confirm things that we probably already knew or that others would confirm about ourselves, about the kind of the ways that maybe we're thinking or exploring or imagining. I think it comes down probably to this sense of connectedness, or how actually in the writing around the Screensaver project, I write a little bit about neurodiversity or neurodivergence and in relation to language and touch and this dance. In that text, I talk a little bit about a time when I lived and worked in Venice for 6 months, and how being in that city helped me to think with this emerging understanding of neurodivergence, because whilst it's absolutely invited to get lost in Venice, it's only really a problem if you thought you had to go from A to B. And in truth, you often go from A to like W, and then you're in Z, and then you're at C again, because there's such an organic kind of flow between tiny spaces and streets, and then large expanses that you didn't know were there. And like, how is it possible? I didn't know this huge space was there. And so this kind of moving through for me is quite similar, I think, to how I experience associations between images and textures and language. And I don't really have a different experience. My different experience is in relation to maybe more like neurotypical structures and how they understand me. And of course, I do better, more and more to have confidence in the ways that I experience and make, and to kind of defend that. But it's not really possible to say sort of how it could be different, because it also just is. And maybe something there to say is that alongside my own artistic practice, I support other artists. I'm in lots of different kinds of conversations with people who are mostly also neurodivergent, which means so many different things. And there's a kind of something that I think of as like an algorithm of trust, as people get referred to you to be in conversation, which only kind of proliferates, in my case, my understanding of what neurodivergence is. And I think ultimately, if we are going to be in a future where we get to look back on this moment and these conversations about neurodiversity, I think we might be less interested in these labels or binaries, and we might just understand that some of us have had more privilege to explore that than others, but many artists and creators and technologists have always been thinking slightly differently, and that's a really good thing.
Totally agreeing with what you just said. Language and perception, for me at least, they seem to play a role in your work. We spoke already about attention, perception, but also about language. How do you approach the relationship between movement and thought and the use of words also in language?
I was thinking about it in relation to the Screensaver, because something that audiences won't tend to see actually, but they will see in Berlin, is how much language is part of the rehearsal process. And that's because we're working with this kind of funneling symmetrical coordination physically, which in some ways can be quite a constraint. But as I think most writers would know, from constraint and from limitation actually comes huge potential, like proliferation and creativity. And in the studio, when I was first kind of researching and then developing and then shifting to maintaining Screensaver, so the point at which it was kind of made, but my job was a maintenance role, I found the role of language in the studio to remind us of the images that we'd previously found to be generative was so important. And likewise, that the dancing, at least in my own life, was allowing me, it was kind of hanging, like ideas that I have or questions I have about relationship, which often get worked out in language because we talk to each other on the phone or we text or whatever, were actually being supported by the experience of working with the dance. And so a lot of writing was happening for me around the project. And language is also, it's expensive to work in a studio with dancers, and in some ways, like working with yourself with language in your own mind or notebook is cheap. Of course, it's not really cheap because there's another kind of set of constraints and they're attentional. I think what has made it from the dance into language and text is like another, it's not exactly a sibling the way that the dance iterations are. Maybe it's another kind of relation that travels alongside us. And it helps again to bring our attention back to things that otherwise might be easily forgotten, because the dancers, we're also working with attention and our attention is limited. I mean, I have so much to say about this. I don't know. Should I just keep talking?
No, I think you can. I mean, I think this is interesting, for example, because when the people will see the work, but also look into the photos and the videos that we have on the website, there's this more or less kaleidoscopic like aspect of the movement that folds and unfolds, right? And I was wondering also how the choreography also is developed. I mean, do you have like text scores that you all follow? Is there cues? So I was also thinking about language in that sense of like how you keep track of the choreography. If there's like a, I don't know, a sentence or an input that you all have at the same time, that then forms the movement and the choreography that you do.
Yeah, so we have, I think in a way you're kind of talking about dramaturgy, like the kind of the story of the dance. So it would be important to mention the soundscape, which is, again, just to come back to things I said earlier about sort of working with multiple materials. The sound is really, it's kind of a ground, or it's a set of textures and movements that are spatialized that we're also pushing into, which we're in relationship with, which does some of that work that you're saying around timekeeping or giving us something to be in relation to that's outside of all the kind of disorienting touch. And we do have a dramaturgy with the sound of how the sound is moving and changing that runs through the piece, which is more or less stable. So we have these, I call them gates, these kind of passages that we pass through, which shut down or open up more possibilities in the movement score. So there's a kind of direction that we're all going together. But I also think of the lines of the score that we're following as dancers as being kind of like hormones. So even if, say, the sound is like hormonal and we're kind of organs, the hormones are acting on us with slightly different effects and in different times because we're part of this organic system. And so whilst we are going through it together, we're also going through it slightly differently, which sort of brings back, it's to some things that you were saying about language, and also how I was talking about this kind of multi-partiality and kind of dance and words, because when we come out of the dance at the end, we often have this debrief moment, which I always find really funny, where the five of us will be like, but hang on, your hands, no, her legs went, but did you fly? No, I flew, but then you flew. And we're trying to put it together in a way where actually none of us have the full story of what's happened. And neither do the audience, because everyone's moving around. And there's something about how then the dance can't be held in language, just provisionality, that I find really humbling, the sense that hopefully we'll keep going with this project and it slightly changes. Different people come in and out as screensaver dancers, and so they bring their own energies and perspectives and dynamics. And yet there's also something that's kind of consistent running through, which is also my job as a lead artist to kind of take care of.
You've been mentioning also how the sound is also super important for the work, and also you mentioned the rest of the performers. So what I feel also is that for you, collaboration is very important to create the works. It's also usually is a very important aspect when we speak about interdisciplinary practice. So how do you work together with your collaborators, and also how you share authorship and how this process evolves?
It's another big question. I think I'm often in this position of being a lead artist, and depending on the project that I'm working in, I will have some different responsibilities. And something that I've really loved about my collaboration with Jamie Forth, who does the sound for Screensaver, is how these two kind of tracks of the sound world as it relates to the space, and the dance as it relates to the sound and the space, and also the text, how they've kind of grown up together. And in this case, Jamie's research interests in touch and movement, and he's working in kind of like movement computing, that kind of world, and sound programming and live sound programming, and it's also a musician. How they're very complementary, because we found and we've built a shared language of collaboration, which also includes also the gaps of when we don't know together or when we differently know, which relates also to how the dance is working. So it's really a pleasure to be in a position sometimes to sort of build these collaborative relationships with people. And I guess because I work a lot with score systems. So there's a lot of agency that the people who I'm working with in, let's say, the dance role or the co-working dancer role, that they have to bring interest, ideas, perspectives, orientations to what it is that we're doing. And there's maybe something else that's a little bit harder to say, but something I'm interested in, which is how, for me, my projects are, I think of them more and more as, I don't know if I said this to you before, but as kind of like homeschools, to go somewhere together, or for me to go somewhere that I might not always know the way, or sometimes I have the image and it's like how to get there is not super clear. And so there are times when I'm working in collaboration with somebody who has maybe a different skill set to me, and instead of commissioning them to do the work, I might ask them to support me to do the work, and they might do some parts of the work that are like beyond my skill set. So in Berlin, a nice example is a longtime friend and collaborator, Russell Harris, who supported me to make the big red flags, as I call them, for Sometimes. So we worked together on that. And for me, as part of my journey, is I'm not really interested in replicating something that I know how to do. I am always kind of reaching into some other space, and a great pleasure in collaboration is that you get to come into someone else's world a little bit, which I think is probably something that underlines what any good relationship is. I don't know, what do you think?
Totally. And I think sometimes I think that's one of the differences between performance arts and visual arts. I feel generally that the performing arts field is much more collaborative. Like, it's hard for people to do a work for a stage totally alone. It's almost impossible also on the logistical level. So there's always this shift and creation of relationships that people get together and then they go to each other's lives and then they meet again when the show comes. People come together and there's all this flux of relationships, which I think it enriches the work.
Yeah, absolutely. We also have a lot of folk who make really expensive solos where you're like, there must be 20 people on the edge of that stage making that thing possible, and it's not a collaborative work. Or artists who work with huge numbers of, often, I don't know if it's true, if it's always artists working with dancers, but the sort of unnamed mass of collaborators or dance collaborators who, even if they're not in that moment performing in that work, their labour and their expertise is a material part of the legacy of that work, but it's often kind of concealed in a way. And I think that's a question around the labour of dancers in particular, because of hierarchies of labour.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, we've been speaking a lot about scores, and I mean, I think the majority of people know about musical scores, which is this partiture and paper where the notes are written. Can you give us an example of what is a choreographical score for your work, for example?
Yeah, I always somehow struggle with this. I guess for me, the way that I think of a score is a little bit like, say you're at home and you need to go to the shop or to school or whatever. In a way, a score can be a little bit like, from the beginning of your journey to the end of the journey, there are certain things that you will encounter along the way. You don't always know exactly where and when you'll encounter them because they have agency, but it could be like other people or traffic or birds or whatever. There might be different routes that you could take on that journey. But for sure, some routes are going to take you not on that journey. And if the score is to do that journey, then there are some restrictions, some things that are in and some things that are out. And then along the way, if you choose to walk, then that changes how you're going to make that journey. Or if you choose to cycle, or if you have a mobility device, or if you're going with a toddler, etc., etc. So I feel like, I don't know, that's a very literally pedestrian example, but somehow I think that can help. I think a score can be the ingredients or the considerations or the restrictions along the way that we're busy with whilst we try and do something we're doing. So for the Screensaver, a very simple top line summary of the score would be that we're in this unit, this kind of body symmetry coordination, and that we keep it for the length of time and we have to swap places. That doesn't ultimately make a dance, those instructions, but it's like one layer, and then on top of that we have lots of other layers of the score which are to do with how we relate to the sound and how that changes over time, different kinds of touch, different kinds of dynamics, different kinds of images. So at the beginning we have the image of a lava lamp, and we have a score that we call Resting Reorganized, or Reorganizing Rest, that starts more with resting and it quite quickly deals more and more with organizing or reorganizing. So we ask ourselves, could I rest here? Yes, but I won't, and I go on. So for me, like, these kind of, a score is also has these kind of puzzles inside of it. I don't know if that's a very clear answer, but it's the one that you've got on the spot.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, I mean, I think each choreographer will give a different answer, and this is also nice to have a bit of information about how you also see scores.
I just thought of something else actually that might help. In this first question you asked me, in a way, about the screensaver. It's like, and a bit like my answer about hormones and organs, there's maybe hardware and software, and maybe the software is the program or the score, the set of instructions, and the hardware is the body or the system that's running that. And I think that's also what's interesting for me, is that the same instructions or the same score will happen really differently with a different system or a different hardware or a different body.
Yeah, totally. I think that's also very beautiful also, that then makes the piece also alive, right? That's not a totally fixed amount of movement, specific gesture that you will do, but it's a living being, so to speak. Yeah. To keep talking about collaborations, we have a very lively, colorful, full of patterns costumes. And for Berlin also, we're going to have like beanbags also in following that aesthetics. Can you speak also how you decided for these costumes and how important this visual aspect is for the work?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I love talking about costume. I always feel like a little hitch in my system when someone calls me choreographer, because I'm like, just not a choreographer. I think I'm probably a designer, a writer and a designer. I don't know. The costume is really important, and it arrived close, very close to, once I understood what it was that we were making, the idea for the costume was right there. So the costume, for those who haven't yet seen the work or don't know, so we're this kind of mass of bodies that are nearly always in some kind of touch. And you kind of, as an audience member, you kind of lose track of whose limbs are whose at times. And so the costumes kind of support that disorientation or losing us, or let's say camouflage, like co-camouflage. But they also support differentiation, and it's quite subtle. So it was important that they would have pattern, and that they would have different pattern and different color, but within a palette that kind of feels like it belongs together. And so when I was looking, so I sourced everything from mostly secondhand shops. You've got this kind of like slightly 70s-ish kind of upholstery type kind of vibe, yeah. Like home decor, lots of florals and lots like some dog tooth and checks and different things. So I was looking at like visual perception and like how babies recognize pattern and differentiation in faces and all that kind of stuff from kind of developmental and cognitive psychology, and then looking at things like magic eye and different kind of illusions and patterns. And I was interested in creating a costume design where sometimes it's like the pixelation of the pattern or the level of detail is quite similar across the costumes, but then there'll be a couple of patterns that are a little bit different, that are easier to track and stand out, and they all have different colors. So a little bit like how animals camouflage themselves or octopi kind of change, is kind of playing with this similar thing. So that if your eye was to cross from someone's legs to someone's torso to someone else's arms, there would maybe be a question around if it's the same body, because the pattern density and pixelation is kind of similar detail, and yet because we're moving, that's giving you a different layer of information, and because they're different colors, that's giving you different information. So it's all kind of supporting the same idea of being both together and being individuated. So that's kind of how it emerged. And then it was like a lot of like trying to source things. And an ongoing nightmare I have is that somewhere along the way on tour, we might lose the costumes. Then I'd have to like randomly source them from whatever local, like Humana or something. And how actually that would be really difficult.
That will not happen. No. I think I'm quite confident. You've been speaking on and off about the perception of time. And also from the talks that we had before, it feels that your work is also an invitation to experience time in a different way when people experience your works. So why is the time so important for you also in terms of reflection? You also have different works, if you want also to speak about them, the ones that also connect more with time.
It's another good question, and it's one that I can talk around. But I mean, I have an anecdote about a traumatic incident in relation to time that, you know, could be like a psychotherapeutic answer to why I'm preoccupied with time. But I also, in another sense, whilst I can talk meaningfully about time in different ways through each of my projects, it's not something that I don't have a plan. I don't think, okay, so I've dealt with clock time with this piece, The Human Clock. I've made a work in 2019 that was looking at the Doomsday Clock, which is the bulletin of atomic scientists, kind of bulletin for how close humans are to sort of ending everything for everyone, using the clock as a kind of familiar dramaturgical device. So, but I don't start a project and think, okay, how am I going to deal with time next? It just always is there. So that we don't know. Maybe like later on in my career, I'll have a better kind of answer. But I do know that I think I'm thinking with time always, even in my friendships. Like, when did I last see you? Okay, and I'm like somehow mapping that. But yeah, time runs through everything. And one of my earliest works is called The Human Clock, which is, it really like does what it says. It's a clock it looks like a digital clock, but it's analog materials, and it looks quite simple. It's a performer who's living inside of that time and reproducing that time. And then we invite people who are passing by, if they'd like to learn it and embody it, and they can kind of do a short shift. But what that work is actually really doing is kind of creating an encounter. So even people who are like, what is this? They stay to ask this question, what is this? And then they often have something else to say about, I don't know, how they've been living their life or how busy they are and how they don't have time for this. And it's like, but you also literally have just been here 20 minutes telling me you don't have time for this time. and that work, like actually a lot of works I've made, just tends to keep coming back, I think, because time is something that we are in an ongoing way interested in and are literally inside of. So, and we're producing and questioning, and therefore it's also current, even if it aesthetically is maybe feels at some point outdated. So clock time, and then I'm really interested in duration, and what duration, particularly in this work, Satellite or Dance for the Gallery, brings by mirroring the working day, this sort of 8-hour more or less day, and of course then that brings labour, and duration allows us to travel differently with material, and in this case the material is conversation as well as a quite boring dance that just is ongoing, which is replicating something of the kinds of labour that I've done a lot of in my life, like repetitive work. With Screensaver, it's this kind of like moratorium on meaning making, how the screensaver pops up and it's not asking you to like, it's somehow maybe a bit more spacious. It's giving you a different kind of space and a commentary on time and labour. Sometimes, I mean, that's a project all about time and different kinds of time, like bringing together kind of this poetic score that tracks through, I guess, history and social histories in a way, alongside a dance, which I call the kind of a dance of tectonic plates, which is like slowly drifting. And that, because in a theatre space, of course, we can manipulate time and we can replicate some experiences of time, like this ADHD kind of time blindness experience where you don't know how long things are going to take, you know. We're also somehow submitting ourselves to that if we go into a theatre, especially if we haven't read the programme note. That's kind of interesting, I think, when you talk about also neurodivergence and making. We can do things with materials in a theatre space or a gallery space that is giving people a different, kind of exercising their experience of time. So, I mean, I could be more specific, and I could talk endlessly about
great.
time.
I think also like exactly also what you said in towards the end now is also like that the work also potentials a different perception of time, and also I think is also what is for me so fascinating, and also what attracts me so much also when I'm in the theater. Also like there's a different stretch of time. Sometimes it can also feel very long that you wish that it could finish earlier, or also like too short for the intensity of the things that you witness there. And I think also that's the beauty of it.
Yeah, and we have two versions at the moment of Screensaver. One is a slightly shorter, we call it cycle, and one is a slightly longer one. And actually the dance collaborators tend to prefer the longer because some of them have said it's deeper. It allows also them to come into time differently with the materials and with each other. And I think as a challenge also for an audience who might be like, oh, is it just going to be this one thing? And it's like, maybe, which is also quite, I think it's quite an autistic idea to be like, it's this one thing. I'm going to keep going at this one thing, and this one thing's going to maybe not give birth to anything else. And then it does. But going through the discomfort of letting go of our attachment to diffusing our attention kind of willfully, like picking up a phone or having a conversation, and instead staying with something and allowing that something to unfold and kind of give the encounter more surface area to give back to us something, is something I'm really interested in, because that's really difficult to do also in our lives these days. And it can happen, and it can certainly happen in the theatre. And I'm interested in that conversation with people and their bodies and how they experience, and also falling asleep is welcome.
Yeah, that's the subtitle of the piece, right? The sleeper software. And so do you see this series as an ongoing thing, or for you it's complete now and you have different iterations, but you...
I think I didn't have a plan at the beginning. There's a tension between the consistency of it as a work to be programmed. So you as a curator programmer have an idea of what you'll get, but also that inside of that it's different, that promise. I think if I come back to maintenance and where my role is maybe transitioning to as my responsibility is how do I maintain this if this work does continue going? How do I maintain this through and beyond the specific mind, body or body-bind Eleanor Bowerism systems that have made it with me and danced it with me? I think it could go on. I think we would have to allow it to be inherited by different people at some point, which I think is really interesting. I've also, as you know, set myself this challenge in a way to present it slightly differently in Berlin, which I'm really excited about. So you're going to get to see both one of the sisters, or actually two or three of the sisters, the iterations, so people can come back different days and it will be slightly different, but also to show you more something that feels actually more intimate, which is a bit more my orientation to it as in this maintenance role, which is kind of the text world. I don't think it will ever be finished because we frequently discover new things, and our last show in October in London, I thought might be the last one for a while. And we came out and we'd had such a great show and we were like, what did you do? This was we've never done this before. It's like someone who's been dancing it for like almost 10 years. It's like she found new things because we're different. And I think that's really beautiful, and it's not always the case. In fact, it's not so often the case with dance. So I feel very humble and very lucky, actually, to have made something that has this enduring, changing quality.
Yeah, amazing. I think it's going to be great to have you with you. I mean, we are recording this episode of the podcast in April, so there's still some months to go. But yeah, it's going to be very exciting when you come and when we can share this show with the public of Berlin. Yeah. So thanks so much, Neve, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.